Fisheries biologists just completed their fall reproduction surveys on many lakes in North Dakota. Today we're visiting with Fisheries Management Section Leader Scott Gangl to go over all the details. I'm Mike Anderson with the North Dakota Game and Fish Department.
Fall reproduction surveys are our guys go out in the fall with smaller gears than what they would normally use to sample the adult population. And we're surveying our lakes for smaller fish. What we're looking for is evaluating stocking success and natural reproduction on most of our lakes around the state. Well, it's probably not as important to anglers because the fish that we're going after are young of the year or this year's hatch, but it's important for fisheries biologists because they use that information to make decisions on management decisions on stocking and forages and things like that. So it helps us guide our decisions to know, are the fish reproducing in certain lakes? Are the fish that we stocked surviving? Are they growing? That's an important factor to make it through the winter. And so on. And so then as we go into fall, now that some of our surveys are done, our staff are going to be looking at our data and making recommendations for next year already here in October. So we're using that information right away to factor into our next year's stocking decisions. It's just one more piece of the puzzle. So in the fall of the year, we get these young of the year fish. We know whether we had good reproduction or poor reproduction. We know whether our stockings were good or whether they didn't work so good. And that kind of just gives us an idea of what's there now. We still got to get them through their first winter. That's a huge bottleneck and a huge hurdle to jump through for a lot of fish. But in many cases, if we can get those fish there, I mean, it's always a good starting point to have fish in the lake to start with. And then once they recruit to an adult fish, once they get through that first winter, then we'll have a little bit better comfort knowing that they're going to survive and grow and be there for anglers in the future. So the guys prioritize based on the lakes that are important to anglers. So like our top tier lakes are big lakes like Lake Sakakawea, Devil's Lake, Lake Oahe, the Missouri River system. Those are always going to get sampled every year. And then we've got our smaller district lakes. Some of them are very important. Some of them get a lot more use than others. And so we try to prioritize those as well. And then as we get down towards the lower end of the priority list that we have a lot of lakes out there that don't see as much use. And then we kind of pick and choose. So if we're stocking a lake for the first time, we might want to know how that stocking did. Or if we're interested in knowing whether we had good reproduction, if we've had poor reproduction for a while, we might want to kind of monitor a lake to see when that lake is producing and so on. So we kind of work on that priority list, and then the biologists pick those lower priority lakes based on what they want to learn out of that lake. In the past, we've kind of had this feeling that our smaller lakes don't have consistent natural reproduction, but there is always a little bit going on out there. One way that we can evaluate that is by taking a year off. Some of the lakes, we may not stock them every year, and then that way we can go out there and sample, and if we sample, say walleye for example is a good example. Some of the lakes, if we didn't stock walleye and we saw a lot of young of the year walleye, we know that those came from natural reproduction. And we do see some of that in some places. I don't know that we saw a lot of it this year around the state, but there were some instances where the guys did note good reproduction. One example that stands out is Lake Addie in the northeast saw really good reproduction, and we didn't stock it this year. Overall, I would say it's probably average to above average. You know, it really varies from lake to lake on an annual basis, you know, what we see out there. There are going to be some years where it's going to be all good or all bad, but most years are going to be somewhere around that average if you're talking about the whole state. Now there's going to be certain areas around the state where we may have seen better perch reproduction. I think that was one thing that I noted in a lot of going over some of the field staff notes. We saw a lot of natural reproduction of perch in some places, almost too good in some places where we already have abundant perch and we don't need more. And that's kind of a thing to note too, is we don't always need natural reproduction every year. We don't need good year classes every year. It's nice to have some spacing in there to let a good year class grow and survive and grow up and stuff. So if you have too many year classes back to back to back, it results in too many smaller fish out there. There's going to be some suppression of the following years. And so we're going to see some of that in some of our smaller bluegill, perch lakes and stuff like that. We've noted a little bit of that in some of those lakes. There were some walleye lakes too, and that's one of the other notes that we saw in certain areas of the state. We've had some poor recruitment in recent years, which means that we haven't had good reproduction, we haven't had good stocking success. Some of the lakes, like a good example is Rice Lake down by Strasburg. That one we've had a really hard time establishing a good walleye stocking, and for a number of years now. And it seems like in general, a lot of those lakes, at least in the south central part of the state, were noted as having pretty good year classes of walleye this year, which is a good sign, you know, because that goes back to having back-to-back year classes. Now when we haven't had a good year class in a few years, we've seen some good success with some of those walleye stockings. So there weren't any older year classes there to suppress those stockings this year. So hopefully that's a good sign for some of those lakes. They got a little bit of a shot in the arm this year for walleye. All of the big three seem to have had really good walleye reproduction this year. That's kind of noteworthy because all three of them were doing really well. You know, the big three being Lake Sakakawea, Lake Oahe, and Devil's Lake. So Devil's Lake is one that we saw really good walleye reproduction success this year. We stock a few in Devil's Lake on the east end. It's usually saltier over there and we don't see as consistent reproduction, but that's all we do is stock the east end of the lake. The rest of the lake has been mostly natural reproduction for walleye. This year, the guys saw a record number of young of the year fish out there, which is pretty significant considering that we didn't have a huge snowpack and a lot of runoff. The last time we had a record catch like that was in 2009 when we had a really good snowpack year and a lot of runoff that year, and we kind of felt like that may have contributed to a good year class that year. Well, now this year we had the opposite and we had a record year class. So we're kind of learning as we go about what produces these record year classes out there, and it's kind of interesting to note that we had such a strong year class of walleye there. Other lakes that are connected in the system also saw pretty good, like Stump Lake downstream also saw really good walleye reproduction this year as well, so that was good. Also on Devil's Lake, we saw a pretty good year class of yellow perch this year too, which is significant because it's been a few years since we've had good perch reproduction. They really also like that rising water and they really like the conditions when the lake is coming up, and it's been pretty static for a few years. So we haven't seen a lot of consistent good reproduction of perch on Devil's Lake, but this year we saw a pretty good year class. Not a record like the walleye, but it's better than it has been for a few years. Lake Sakakawea is another one that we saw really good walleye reproduction on, especially the upper end. We do stock in some bays on the lower end of the lake. We feel that the lower end is a little bit colder. You know, it's slower to warm up in the spring, and so we tend to see less consistent natural reproduction on the lower end of the lake, say the lower third. So we do stock some sites down there. But then on the upper end, from about the middle to upper portion of Lake Sakakawea, we don't stock that very often. And this year we didn't stock it, and we saw really good natural reproduction up there of walleye. It's on a lake-wide basis, I think the guys said it was probably the 8th highest catch of young of the year walleye we've ever seen. So that's pretty significant. You know, we saw really good reproduction up there. The stocked sites on the lower end had really good survival, so that was good. We also saw pretty good reproduction of some of our forages up there. You know, the Goldeye had a pretty noteworthy catch rate this year, so that's good too, because we needed some forage out there. The one thing that is missing and that anglers have been starting to notice is a downturn in our northern pike populations, because they require a lot of flooded vegetation for spawning, and they haven't had that in a few years. And so we tend to see really big year classes of northern pike when we have a rising water after maybe a drought or something like that, and the reservoirs are coming back up. We see those year classes really respond, and we haven't had that in a few years. So our northern pike are kind of down, and we didn't see very good reproduction this year again, but hopefully we'll see some, you know, with the lower lake levels that we have now, if we have some snowpack, we'll see a good rise next spring, but that remains to be seen. Lake Oahe was also another one that was good for walleye. We had another year class of walleye down there. That's one of those lakes that we've had really consistent back to back for a number of years now, really good consistent reproduction of walleye, and it's almost getting to be too much. But at least our forage base is starting to come back. Down on Lake Oahe in South Dakota, they're starting to see more smelt down there, and Lake Whitefish have been producing some forage down there. We also saw some gizzard shad reproduction on the river and Lake Oahe this year, and that's something that the guys really noted as being, you know, better than it has been for a number of years. You know, the gizzard shad are really sensitive to the cold water and the hard winters, and they've died back when we had some harder winters in the past, and they're slowly rebuilding their numbers throughout the reservoir and river. We're looking pretty good across the state. You know, our water levels kind of varied based on whether we're wet or dry, but overall I think our fisheries are in pretty good shape around the state.